My name is Deirdre Krasula, and I'm a graduate student at Clemson University studying nutrition. I'm here today to talk with you a little bit about nutrition in general, and a little bit more on produce, including fruits and vegetables, as well as whole grains. I like to say, first and foremost, that eating healthy starts at home. It's a great place to start, a great place to get a good idea of what's going into your food, and if you can and have the time, involving your family in your cooking will also get them involved and interested in nutrition. How many of you here would say that you cook at home at least 3 times a week? How about 5 times a week? Cooking at home is really a great place to start, like I said before. When you cook at home, you know what's going into your food, and you have a better sense of portion control. Speaking of portion control, I'm going to talk with you now about general nutrition. Previously, you probably learned about the food pyramid. That's what we all grew up with. The government's gone away from that and has what I think is a much better tool for you to visualize what you need. If you can, take a look at the handout that you have in front of you. This is my plate. Rather than the food pyramid, you now see that you just have really 4 main groups to focus on. In terms of nutrition, there are 3 big groups of food that you're always going to be eating. There's your protein source, your carbohydrate, and your fat. My plate breaks it down a little bit further than that. As you can see, half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables. That's the really, really big thing that we're going to focus on today. The other sections, as you can see, about a quarter should be grains, half of which should be whole grains, but I'll get to that later. And a quarter should be protein. They also factor in space for dairy, if you drink milk, if your kids drink milk, and what you can't see on the plate is also space for fat, which doesn't necessarily have to be your general fat like butter. It's also things like vegetable oils and nuts. So just keep in mind, with my plate in front of you, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it and how you have access to it. It's a free resource available to you online. You just go to that website that's listed on the bottom of your handout and you have access to it. You can access it on your computer, on the phone, and if you don't have access to any of those things, you can always access it at the library. Like I said, it's free, and there's lots of different things for you to play around with other than just what you saw on the handout. There's games for your kids. You can input your food that you've eaten for that day, that week, and it will break down the nutrients that you've eaten if you want to know a little bit more in depth about how you're doing in terms of your nutrient goals. So looking at how you should be eating in general nutrition, my plate makes it very simple. Like I said, half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, a quarter should be protein, a quarter should be grains. But if you'd like to go a little bit beyond that, for women who are in the age range of 31 to 50, you need about 1,800 to 2,200 calories a day. In terms of carbs, that's 40 to 60% of your calories, fats 20 to 35%, and protein about 10 to 35%. So as you can see, there's always a lot of wiggle room, and you're just trying to get a good balance of foods with really focusing, again, on fruits and vegetables as half your plate. I can't emphasize that enough. So looking at my plate one more time, I'm going to really reinforce this with you. Probably be tired of hearing it, but how much of your plate should be fruits and vegetables? Right, a half. So we can see that a quarter, or about a quarter, in that range should be grains. So now I'm going to talk to you about whole grains and what that means. So Do any of you have an idea of what it means to be a whole grain? I get that the definition of a whole grain can be confusing. It's sort of a term that's out there in the media a lot, but you might confuse it with multigrain or whole wheat. That's not the same thing. Whole grain means that a grain, when it grows in its natural field, has 3 parts. When it's a whole grain, it still has all 3 of those parts when you're eating it. So if it's not a whole grain, it has 2 of those parts removed. You can see that when you look at the second handout in front of you. So this handy little picture, it shows you what a whole grain kernel is. As you can see, there's the bran, endosperm, and germ. And if it's a whole grain, it has all 3 of those. This sheet's also great because it gives you a list of what whole grains are. There's your common whole grains like brown rice, oatmeal, popcorn, and your trendier grains like quinoa. Another great option is whole cornmeal, which you might not necessarily think corn is a grain, but it is, and whole cornmeal and popcorn are great options for whole grains. The other thing with whole grains, like I said, even though you're getting a quarter of your plate at each meal as grains, you don't always have to be eating whole grains. That's really difficult and might seem overwhelming at first. But if you try to get 50% of your grains that you eat across the day as whole grains, you're doing a great job. And if you think about it, 50% really just means having oatmeal for breakfast and, maybe a whole grain at lunch. So a whole wheat bread that you know is a whole grain. That's already beyond your 50%, and you don't even have to worry about it at dinner. The other important thing to remember when looking at whole grains is, like I said, it's not always as clear as you might think, so don't get tricked by labels. If you see something that says multigrain, it's not always going to be a whole grain, so you really want to look at a food label if you're picking up a loaf of bread. Look at the first ingredient. If it says whole wheat flour, then it's a whole grain. If it says brown rice as the first ingredient, sometimes they use brown rice flour. If it says oatmeal flour, those are all whole grains. So it's really just important to look at the label, and you'll have a better sense of what you're eating, and you'll just get a better hang of finding out what is a whole grain. So you have in front of you 2 different bread options that are being passed around. I want you to take a look at the labels. One's a whole grain, one isn't. Just take a look at the labels and see if you can figure out the difference, and just talk about it amongst yourselves. Okay, now that most of you have looked at the labels, and if they're still going around, that's fine, I'm just going to re-emphasize what we talked about. Whole grains mean that the grain which you're eating has all 3 parts of the natural grain. It's how it grows. When you're eating whole grains, remember we're trying to get a quarter of our plate, like my plate says, to be grains. Now, can anybody remember what I said in terms of how many whole grains to get each day? 50%. So, now that we know, looking back at my plate, we want half of our plate fruits and vegetables, a quarter grains, and if we make those grains whole grains 50% of the time, we are already meeting a lot of our nutrient goals and doing a great job. So, since I already talked so much about the importance of fruits and vegetables on our plate, I'm going to talk about produce now. So, like I said, half of our plate should be fruits and vegetables. I think we have that down pat. But you might think that that could get a little bit boring. You don't just have to eat a salad with every meal. We want variety. I like to say, try to get the rainbow if you can in your fruits and vegetables. Eat lots of colors. When you have a variety of colors in your fruits and vegetables, you're getting the most vitamins and minerals that you can out of your produce. And that's really what we want. We want all of those vitamins and minerals. We don't have to be specific about them right now, but by eating lots of different colors, you're getting the most variety, and therefore you're getting the most nutrients that you can possibly be getting. With produce, you might be a little bit overwhelmed about, should I buy fresh, should I buy frozen, should I buy canned? One's more expensive, one's not in season. Well, in terms of cost evaluation, Adair is going to talk about that in a little bit, but I have some helpful tips for you right now. With fresh produce, you want to buy something when it's in season. That's just because it's going to be hopefully local, and it won't have traveled that far to get to the grocery store you're buying it from, so it will have the most nutrient value in it. So when you're buying fresh, try to buy something that's in season, because you're going to get the most nutrient value from it. If you are buying frozen, for instance, that's a really good option too. One thing that I think surprises a lot of people, and even surprised myself, was that in 1998, the government said that frozen vegetables have the same nutrient content as their fresh counterpart. And that's because when frozen vegetables are frozen, they're picked when they're most nutrient dense. They're picked when they have every vitamin and mineral you could possibly want, and they're immediately frozen. So you're not losing that, and it's a really great option, and if something's not in season, it's even better, because it's probably going to taste better, if not as good as something that you're buying from the fresh section. The one thing that I do warn about frozen is when you're buying vegetables, just be careful and make sure that there's no added sodium. And with fruits, there shouldn't be sodium added, but you can always check for that too, but make sure there's no added sugar. You really want your produce, if it's frozen, to be as close to its natural form as possible. Taking a look at canned, it's sort of the same idea. They are very close to being of nutritional value as the fresh product, not quite as much as frozen because they do lose some of that in the canning process, but very, very similar. And you want to be careful, again, with canned especially, look at the sodium content because that's very common. Sodium is used a lot in canning to help preserve, but you can find options that are low or lesser sodium or even no sodium added. So just take a look at the label. Looking at labels is a great way to find out what's going into your body and make sure that there's low sodium or less sodium added. And again with your fruits, canned fruits also can have sugar in them to help in the canning process, but you can find fruits that are packed in water or light syrup rather than in a heavy syrup, or also even packed in natural juices. So that's a great option. And just remember to look at the labels and you'll be making a great choice. So just to sort of take a survey to see what you're comfortable with, would you say that you tend to buy fresh, frozen, or canned produce more often? And why do you think that is? Why don't you discuss it with each other? That's great. So, just to sort of round everything up and summarize what we've talked about here today, I'm going to grab our first handout one more time and take a look at my plate. Just a reminder, you have this at your fingertips whenever you want. If you want to track what you're eating, if you want to have some games that your kids will learn about eating healthy, that's all on this website. And the most important thing to remember is your portion sizes. When you're cooking at home, it's really easy to control having half of your plate as fruits and vegetables, a quarter protein, a quarter grains. And even when you're out eating, it's just a good visual to have, maybe ask to load up on more vegetables and have a smaller portion of your protein. So just remember that when you're eating at each meal, and you'll have a great starting point for eating well. The other thing we talked about was whole grains. We already know that a quarter of our plate should be whole grains at each meal, and we know that 50% should be whole grains. So can anybody tell me now what is a good example of a whole grain? Brown rice, oatmeal, and popcorn are awesome options for whole grains. You know, they're really easy to substitute. Brown rice over white rice, oatmeal for breakfast in the morning. They're really good. They're, for the most part, just as tasty, I think, and they'll get you to that 50% of whole grains very quickly. So finally, we talked about produce. Can anybody tell me what I said about being careful of when buying canned vegetables especially? Right, be very wary of sodium, but like with whole grains, if you're just looking at those labels, look for sodium. Look for sugar if you're buying fruit. And with the whole grains, look for that first ingredient. You want it to be a grain that you know is a whole grain, like whole wheat flour or oatmeal. So, I hope I helped you a little bit and that you learned something. And have a great day.